Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're opening up a really remarkable chapter of world history, the Meiji Restoration, which officially kicked off back in 1868.
And this wasn't just, a simple change in government.
Not at all. It was a total lightning-fast transformation where Japan leaped from an isolated, fractured, kind of feudal state, a state that had been governed by the Tokugawa shogunate for 260 years.
Right. And it leaped straight into the modern industrial and military age. It's an incredible story.
It really is.
And we are using a whole stack of incredible sources today, relying heavily on primary documents and, some cutting-edge historical analysis to give you the most accurate picture.
So our mission for this deep dive is to go beyond that traditional textbook narrative and really unpack the speed and the contradictions of this whole process.
The speed is what's just so mind-boggling.
It makes it so captivating. I mean, think about the testimony of Fukuzawa Yukichi. He was one of the Meiji era's most influential thinkers, a huge advocate for Western learning.
A real visionary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he marks the progress so precisely in his autobiography. He says, okay, Japan first saw an American steamship in 1853. A black ship.
The famous arrival of Perry.
Exactly. Then they started studying Dutch navigation just 2 years later in 1855. But by 1860, and this is the amazing part, just 5 years after first seeing the technology, Fukuzawa boasts that the Japanese completed a trans-Pacific crossing without relying on a single foreign expert.
Entirely under their own command.
Entirely. That pace. I mean, it's a compressed revolution happening over barely a decade. It's just staggering.
It is. And that velocity is exactly why we need a structured approach here. So for you, we're breaking this massive historical shift into 3 critical fundamental questions that really define the era.
Okay, what are they?
First, what actually caused this radical transition to take place? Second, how was this monumental shift achieved, politically, economically, socially?
And the third.
And finally, what were the immediate societal challenges Japan faced in the aftermath, both internally and globally?
It sounds like a formula for the perfect revolution, but as you said, we have to look for the contradictions. I mean, history is usually written by the victors, right? And we have some excellent sources, including some powerful counter-narratives that challenge that official glorious restoration story. So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
All right, let's start inside Japan. For 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had enforced a period of, peace and very strict isolation called sakoku. They'd been ruling since the early 1600s.
But by the mid-19th century, historians can see that the system was just riddled with these fundamental political weaknesses.
So it's starting to crack.
Completely. The Tokugawa regime was trying to run what was essentially a centralized nation-state, but they were using this impossibly rigid feudal structure to do it.
So while the shogunate held all the central power in Edo modern-day Tokyo, the system itself was breeding this deep resentment among the various daimyo.
The regional feudal lords, yeah. They had to follow these strict rules like the Senkin-Kutai system, the alternate attendance system.
Right, where they had to spend every other year in the capital and their families had to live there permanently, almost as hostages.
Exactly. It was a brilliant tool for political control, but it bled them dry financially. It kept them subservient for sure. But that political architecture was just starting to crumble under its own weight.
And that political rot was then compounded by huge economic strain. The source materials make it really clear that the official social hierarchy, the samurai, farmer, artisan, merchant.
In that order.
Right. It was completely misaligned with the economic reality on the ground.
Completely. I mean, who had the money? The merchants. They were at the bottom of the social ladder, but they were immensely wealthy from all the internal commerce and trade that had developed during this long period of peace.
But they had no social status, no political power.
None. Meanwhile, the samurai, the ruling military class, officially at the top of the pyramid, were slowly bleeding wealth and purpose. They were basically bureaucrats on fixed stipends, often paid in rice.
While inflation and this new commercial growth just rocketed past them, favoring the merchants who dealt in cash.
Exactly. This massive misalignment created a powder keg of systemic instability.
Which meant that the vast majority of the population, the peasants, were suffering under a system that just didn't make any sense anymore.
They were burdened by heavy, often unstable taxation, usually paid in rice. Then you add cyclical famines to this widespread corruption and a growing sense of inefficiency.
And any public confidence the shogunate might have had just completely evaporated.
The government looked not just restrictive, but utterly incapable of managing a changing nation.
And that created the perfect vacuum for an ideological shift.
Precisely. The emperor, who for centuries had been this symbolic, almost sequestered figure in Kyoto with no actual political power, he starts to be seen by these dissident samurai and regional leaders as the true, legitimate national source of renewal.
So that gives the revolution its official retroactive legitimacy. Fuko, the restoration of imperial rule.
That became the official narrative of the 1868 coup.
But, as you warned us earlier, we have to look at whose voices are suppressed by that official narrative. And we have these crucial counter-narratives coming from people who actually served the shogun, the Bakufu retainers.
And they argue that the Tokugawa system was far from just this picture of monolithic decay.
This is so vital, especially for anyone studying this historiography of the Meiji period.
Absolutely. Take Fukuchi Junichiro, who went by Keiichi. He published Bakufu Suiron, that's on the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, in 1892.
And he defends the Tokugawa family.
He does. He defends them against these charges of being backward and incompetent. He argues, and he cites direct evidence, that the Bakufu itself was capable of reform, and crucially, that it was the shogunate leadership that made the tough, pragmatic decision to open the country to foreign trade in the 1850s.
And Fukuchi's interpretation just flips the entire narrative on its head, doesn't it?
It does. He claims the real destabilizing force in the 1860s was the reckless anti-foreignism. The Jew expelled the barbarian movement coming from the Western domains.
From Satsuma and Chushu.
The very domains that later claimed to be saving Japan. He argues the Tokugawa was trying to manage this inevitable opening, while the revolutionaries were the ones creating instability through their radical, often violent ideology.
Then you have another voice, Katsukaishu. He was the one who mediated the bloodless surrender of Edo Castle in 1868.
A key figure. And Katsu, throughout his later life, he vehemently emphasized continuity rather than revolution.
What did he mean by that?
He maintained that Japan's early modernization, things like the development of Western military science schools, the embracing of Western learning, and significantly, those diplomatic missions like the one that crossed the Pacific in 1860 on the Kanrin Maru, all of that, he said, originated in the Tokugawa legacy, often decades before the Meiji coup.
So Katsu's position forces us to question this whole backward feudalism trope.
Completely. He argued that the shogunate had provided peace and stability for over 250 years and was already pursuing openness and innovation when it was deemed in the national interest.
And this perspective is reinforced, isn't it, by the fact that when Katsu later advised the new Meiji government, he often criticized them for their own failings.
He did. He warned them about potential despotism, about favoring urban elites over poor farmers. He basically told them they were repeating the very failings the late Bakufu was accused of.
So this internal debate is crucial. The transition wasn't a clean break. It was a contested process where the new regime, the Meiji oligarchs, successfully co-opted many of the existing administrative and technological structures that the Tokugawa had already established.
It's a much messier, more interesting picture.
Okay, so regardless of who gets the historical credit for those initial steps, there's no denying the stark reality of technological backwardness compared to the West.
Oh, absolutely. 2 centuries of Sakoku isolation meant Japan was far, far behind in military and industrial capability.
And the shock was not abstract. It was immediate and physical.
When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived, their steam-powered technology, their armament, it made it instantly clear that any kind of military resistance was basically impossible.
So the sheer necessity of modernization became paramount for national survival against imperial encroachment.
Exactly.
And that realization totally transformed the intellectual landscape. The initial anti-foreign movement, Sonechi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, that quickly proved itself to be, well, suicidal.
It did. And you see this remarkable moment of pragmatism where the leaders of the reformist domains, especially Satsuma and Chushu, they realized the only way to expel the barbarians is to become just as strong as they are.
You have to adopt their technology to beat them.
Right. So the ideology morphs into this drive for modernization under imperial authority.
Right.
And it's all focused on achieving national strength through that famous slogan, Fukoku Kishei.
Enrich the country, strengthen the military.
That blend of traditional loyalty, the
Yeah.
Sansua, and this aggressive modern pragmatism, the Fukoku Kishei, that was the engine of the revolution.
So this meant that powerful regional leaders from domains like Satsuma, Chushu, Saga, and Tosa weren't just sitting around waiting for the central government in Edo to act.
Not at all. They initiated military modernization themselves. They were bringing in foreign advisors, purchasing Western weapons, and adapting Western military strategy on their own dime.
So there's this dual motivation. On one hand, national survival against the West.
And on the other, this regional ambition to overthrow the weakened shogunate. It was an incredibly potent combination. Adopting Western technology served two immediate and critical goals for these ambitious daimyo and their samurai retainers.
So if the internal decay set the stage, the external catalyst was definitely the arrival of the U.S. Navy under Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853.
This was the moment the door was kicked in.
No question.
Perry's arrival forced Japan to open its ports, but the resulting treaties were undeniably humiliating. The 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the U.S., which is often called the Harris Treaty after the U.S. Consul Townsend Harris, it stripped Japan of its sovereign rights.
And specifically, these were the unequal treaties. They granted foreigners extraterritorial rights.
Which meant they were entirely immune to Japanese law. If a foreigner committed a crime, they were tried by their own consular courts, not by the Japanese.
And just as importantly, they stripped Japan of tariff autonomy.
Right. Japan couldn't set its own customs duties to protect its own nascent domestic industries. Foreign powers dictated the terms of trade.
So this profound undermining of Japanese sovereignty became the ultimate driver for reform.
It did. The intense, almost fanatical desire to modernize wasn't just about building factories or railways. It was about proving to the world, militarily and legally, that Japan deserved recognition as a civilized sovereign nation.
One worthy of renegotiating these humiliating terms on an equal footing.
That was the goal.
And this urgency was palpable even to foreign observers. I mean, American politicians like the former Secretary of State William H. Seward, he visited in 1870 and was apparently very worried about Japan's precarious situation.
He was. He feared that the European powers who were actively carving up China at the time might strike if Japan didn't hurry up its modernization process.
So Seward offered what he saw as essential guidance. He urged them to adopt all of European civilization, not just cherry-pick technologies like the printing press or the telegraph.
He worried that would only lead to a superficial veneer of modernity. He actually told the Japanese leaders that the U.S. should act as Japan's tutor, claiming they had no imperialistic designs, unlike the predatory European powers.
It's just fascinating how the Japanese handled this advice, isn't it?
It really is. They listened carefully to every foreign expert, American, British, French, German. But they retained this remarkable independence. They selectively implemented ideas.
They never truly gave up their unique civilization wholesale, despite Seward's warnings about China.
No. Instead, they reconstructed their nation by blending foreign innovation with indigenous tradition. They chose which aspects of Western life best served their national interest. That became a hallmark of the entire Meiji process.
So the stage was set, the internal pressure was high, and the external shock had occurred. The transition began formally with the Meiji Restoration, which was a coup d'etat, on January 3, 1868.
And this wasn't led by high nobility. It was instigated by lower and middle-ranking samurai from those key Western domains, and they announced the return of political power to the young Emperor Mutsuhito.
But we have to emphasize, this was a classic revolution from above.
Completely. It was organized by the elite. While the emperor was the theoretical sovereign, the actual political power rested with a tight cabal of those victorious former samurai who became known as the genre, or the oligarchs.
And these men, Ichio Obumi, Yamagata Aritomo, Kumashige Ukubo Toshimichi, they were the true decision makers who would rule Japan for the next several decades.
And their goal was crystal clear: creating a powerful centralized government and military to preserve national independence. That Fukoku Kishe slogan in action.
They moved at just astonishing speed to dismantle the old feudal order.
Immediately, they replaced the feudal domains with a centralized system of prefectures run by governors that they appointed. But the crucial move, the really explosive move, was the abolition of the distinct social classes in the mid-1870s.
And with it, the elimination of the hereditary stipends for the samurai.
Right. Those stipends were converted into cash payments or government bonds. And while that move was financially necessary to fund the new national government, for the samurai, it was a profound political betrayal.
And this political move immediately splintered the ruling elite. The Meiji government was fundamentally unstable right from its inception.
Almost immediately after the coup, a fierce internal debate erupted in 1873 over whether Japan should launch a military expedition against Korea.
The Seiken Run. the debate on the conquest of Korea.
Exactly. And this conflict wasn't just about foreign policy. It was a struggle for control of the new government. Major figures like Saya Kakamori from Satsuma, Etu Shinpei from Saga, and Itagaki Taisuke from Tosa, they all advocated for the war.
Partly as a way to employ the now redundant and very angry samurai class.
Yes. But the remaining more conservative oligarchs like Kubo Toshimichi and Iwakura Tomomi had just returned from this 2-year mission observing the West. And they argued Japan was still too weak and needed to focus on internal development first.
The conservatives won that internal battle.
They did. Saigo, Itagaki, and Eicho were all forced out of the government. This solidified power in the hands of that Satsuma and Chushu bloc, led by Ikubo and Icho.
But those who were ousted didn't just fade away. They channeled their political resentment into new challenges, looking to Western political traditions to argue for their return to influence.
So the question then shifted from who rules to how they justify and formalize that rule.
The constitutional debate begins.
Exactly. The ousted oligarchs and outsiders, having been exposed to Western political ideas, they formed the popular rights movement. Itagaki Taisuke of Tosa founded the Liberal Party, the Jiyuche, in 1881.
And that was inspired by French republicanism, right? Emphasizing individual liberty and popular rights.
It was. Then you also saw Suma Shigenobu emerge as a key opposition leader. He was an Anglophile, and he formed the Constitutional Reform Party, the Rikken Kaishinto.
And he advocated for a British-style responsible cabinet system, where the cabinet would answer directly to a national assembly controlled by political parties.
Which was, in the eyes of the ruling genre, dangerously liberal.
So the core conservatives, Icho Hirobumi and that Satsumichu bloc, they rejected both the French and the British models.
They did. They admired the German Empire, specifically the Prussian model. They felt it offered the perfect authoritarian system.
Why Prussian?
Because it provided the appearance of representation through a parliament, but it kept centralized monarchical power completely intact. It allowed them to claim they were modern while keeping the ultimate authority firmly in their hands.
So this ideological split resulted in a major political war. Ijo Hirobumi knew he needed to neutralize Yukuma, whose liberal proposals were gaining a lot of traction.
Right. So in 1881, Ichu successfully forced Kuma's resignation by publicizing alleged scandals involving Shukuma's office in Hokkaido.
It's important to recognize, though, that the corruption claims were kind of secondary, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Ichu's real target was Kuma's constitutional proposal. Ichu criticized it as unpatriotic for suggesting Japan take on foreign debt to fund his reforms.
He masterfully used the scandal to eliminate his chief ideological rival and clear the path for his own conservative vision.
It proves that Meiji politics were often just ruthless power plays disguised as moral debates.
So, with the liberals sidelined, Icho Hirobumi led the effort to draft the Meiji Constitution, which was promulgated in 1889.
And the fact that it was bestowed upon the people by the emperor, rather than being ratified by them, tells you everything you need to know about its conservative nature.
If we look at the constitutional text itself, how does it secure that autocratic power?
Well, we can group the articles into 3 themes that really lock it down. First, you have the imperial war and decree powers.
Okay.
Article 3 declared the emperor sacred and inviolable, and Article 4 vested all rights of sovereignty in him. Crucially, he commanded the army and navy under Article 11. He declared war and made peace under Article 13, and he could issue imperial ordinances with the force of law when the Diet wasn't sitting. That's Article 8.
So the emperor is the ultimate source of power, overriding all other political bodies.
Unquestionably. Second, you have the limited rights for subjects.
Yes, sounds ominous.
It is. While the Constitution granted subjects rights like liberty of speech, writing, and assembly, that's Article X and X, these rights were only guaranteed within the limits of law.
Meaning any law passed by the Diet could restrict them.
Precisely. And Article XEA1 explicitly stated that all these rights could be suspended entirely by the emperor during times of war or national emergency. The rights were conditional, not inherent.
And the third theme?
Finally, the fiscal autonomy of the oligarchy. The Diet, the parliament, consisted of an elected House of Representatives and an unelected aristocratic House of Peers.
So not exactly a democratic body.
Not at all. And while Article V said the emperor exercised legislative power with the consent of the Diet was basically neutered by financial constraints. Article XX protected the expenditures of the imperial house from being rejected or reduced.
And Article XENS protected all existing legal obligations, including much of the massive military budget, from any parliamentary oversight.
So in short, they adopted the outward structure of a modern constitutional monarchy. a parliament, a cabinet, a set of defined rights. But all the real unfettered power remained locked away with that small autocratic elite, protected by the divinity of the emperor.
It was the perfect system for rapid modernization without any democratic interference.
Exactly.
So the political system wore a Prussian mask, but the economic transformation was driven by surprisingly dynamic, often free market principles, though initially it was all directed from the top.
That's a great way to put it.
The first step was radically restructuring the economy's foundation, land ownership. By 1870, the former feudal lords were required to return their land to the emperor.
And this paved the way for the 1873 land tax reform. This centralized the land tax and critically shifted collection from payment in rice to payment in money.
And this cash-based land tax was the only viable, stable source of government revenue during that early industrialization period.
It was. It provided the predictable financial foundation the National Treasury needed to fund the military buildup and major infrastructural projects like railways and telegraphs.
But, and this is a big but, that financial stability for the government came at a severe cost to the rural population, which we'll definitely get into later. Initially, the Meiji government tried central planning, right? They invested heavily in state-owned enterprises in industries like textiles, mining, and railways.
They did, but historians observe that this largely failed.
Why?
The failure was due to the simple fact that they rushed the process. They were modernizing so incredibly fast that they just lacked the technical expertise, the managerial experience, and the distribution networks necessary for these enterprises to be profitable.
So a lot of these state-owned factories ended up operating at a loss.
A huge loss, which forced a major shift in policy.
And the shift was radical. They moved toward institutional support of private property rights and infrastructure investment, selling off those state-owned factories at bargain basement prices to select private individuals and companies.
And this is the moment that allowed private entrepreneurship to truly flourish.
The entrepreneurial energy came from a really diverse mix of groups. Some capital came from former samurai who converted their stipends into cash or bonds, a rare but significant startup fund.
But the most important energy came from already commercially astute rural farm families like Satu Gentabi in Fukushima and the older merchant houses who had been frustrated by their low social status under the Tokugawa.
And we see two competing yet equally successful models of massive private enterprise emerge from this.
We do. First, you have the Zaibatsu model, famously championed by Iwasaki Ataro, the founder of Mitsubishi.
And Iwasaki emphasized a centralized, single-family-owned model.
Absolutely. Iwasaki's 1878 company policy explicitly stated that Mitsubishi was a single-family enterprise, with the president personally sanctioning all major decisions.
Why was he so insistent on that?
He argued that this autocratic, centralized control was absolutely necessary to maintain viability in intense, often ruthless, international competition. For example, in 1874, Mitsubishi was directly competing against the massive British Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, P&O.
And Iwasaki's centralized authority allowed him to move faster and deploy capital more aggressively than any decentralized model could.
Right. But on the other side, we have the joint stock model, championed by the financier Shibusawa Eiichi.
And Shibusawa acted more like a venture capitalist and facilitator. He helped set up hundreds of companies.
And he focused on distributing ownership among many shareholders, arguing that this model was more transparent and less prone to individual failure.
His approach was more about institutionalizing management.
It was. For example, when Ito Denhichi, the founder of Mi Cotton Textiles, died unexpectedly, Shibusawa stepped in. Not to take control, but to bring in capital and professional management to stabilize the company and ensure its long-term viability. He was promoting the growth of a robust, modern business ecosystem beyond just single-family control.
We also see this incredible domestic ingenuity through what's called import substitution. Think of Hattori Kintaro, the founder of Seiko.
He started in 1881 just selling and repairing imported clocks. But soon, domestic clockmakers, like a tinsmith named Rangi Masajiri, they developed domestic parts.
Specifically clock springs.
Right, using technology that was originally developed for making steel hairpins, and within a few years they had completely replaced the expensive imported springs.
And this localized innovation proves the success of the Meiji economic policy. I mean, by 1929, Seiko was the official timepiece of Japan National Railways.
It shows a rapid transition from simply repairing foreign goods to achieving complete domestic mastery and production of essential modern technology.
But none of this economic or military modernization could have happened without a radical overhaul of the intellectual landscape.
You can't change a country without changing minds.
Exactly. So the Meiji government introduced a new system of compulsory education in 1871-72. It was aimed at universal literacy and encouraging male talent, and it significantly raised the literacy rate from its pre-Meiji level of about 40%.
And again, the ideological architect of this shift was Fukasawa Yukichi. His seminal work, An Encouragement of Learning from 1872, sold millions of copies. It was nothing less than a revolutionary manifesto against the feudal system.
His core thesis directly attacked the traditional status quo. He famously wrote, "Heaven did not create men above man, nor put man under man."
A powerful statement. He asserted that the difference between the wise and the ignorant, the rich and the poor, lays solely in whether a man has studied or not. He completely rejected the idea of divine mandate or inherited status.
And Fukasawa strongly advocated for jitsugaku practical learning that was relevant to everyday commercial and political needs.
He insisted that students reject traditional poetic or Chinese classics and instead focus on the alphabet, composition of letters, bookkeeping, the abacus, geography, natural philosophy, history, economics, ethics.
All of which, he noted, were best acquired through reading translations of Western books.
His goal was to foster the spiritual independence of the people, to guarantee the political independence of the nation.
The educational structure itself was eclectic. It was initially French-inspired, but it quickly shifted to a more informal, decentralized American format in the 1870s under advisors like David Murray.
And this liberalization was also heavily influenced by American missionary teachers. Figures like William E. Griffiths and Mary Eddy Kidder played a fundamental role.
They pioneered Western education, especially in the natural sciences, physics, and chemistry at institutions that would become the foundation of Tokyo University.
And Kidder, in particular, was vital for establishing women's education. She founded the school that became Ferris University, and she stressed self-formation and independence for Japanese women.
Yet, despite the major presence of missionaries and institutions like Meiji Gakuen, Christian conversion remained really limited, didn't it? It hovered around 1 or 2% of the population.
It did. But it's critical to note that the small group of Japanese Christians, who were often educated samurai, they later formed an extremely important leadership nucleus.
Including 8 future prime ministers.
Incredible, isn't it? But this emerging, highly westernized and sometimes Christianized elite was a threat to the centralized Meiji state's control over national ideology.
Which is why the government moved decisively to provide an indigenous moral and political foundation in 1890 with the imperial rescript on education.
Exactly. The rescript was the conservative answer to the liberal ideas that had been unleashed by Jitsugaku.
So issued by the emperor, it balanced the drive for Western learning with this insistence on traditional loyalty, filial piety, and strict obedience to the Constitution and law.
It served as a binding, mandatory ideological text. It was read aloud in every school. It ensured that while Japan pursued modern efficiency, its moral heart remained loyal to the emperor and the centralized state.
The pace of transformation was breathtaking, but it came at an immense social cost. It created immediate and violent domestic challenges for the new government.
And the most significant threat, ironically, came from the very class that instigated the restoration, the samurai.
The abolition of their class and their hereditary stipends in the mid-1870s was a financial necessity for the state, but for them, it was a deep political and psychological wound.
They lost their status, their income, their historical purpose. They felt utterly betrayed by the government they had installed.
This simmering resentment just exploded in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seijuku Takamori.
And Seiju was one of the original powerful reformers, but he turned against the government, seeking to defend samurai honor and traditional morality against what he saw as the decadence of rapid, uncritical westernization.
But the crushing of the rebellion was the definitive event proving the success of the Meiji military reforms.
It was. Seiju's forces were decisively defeated by the new Imperial Japanese Army, which was composed primarily of conscripted commoners, not samurai.
The commoner army crushed the samurai revolt. It symbolized the complete and irreversible end of the old feudal status distinctions.
The government branded Saigo a traitor, yet his popularity was so immense he was viewed as this tragic, principled hero that the government eventually had to officially pardon him in 1889.
Even after his death, his memory was a potent political symbol.
It was. The People's Rights Movement used him as a hero standing against the autocratic Meiji oligarchy, And later critics, like the novelist Tokutomi Roka, referenced Saigo's fate when criticizing government suppression of dissidents like the socialist Kutoku Shizuri in 1911.
While the samurai were eventually neutralized, the second major challenge came from the backbone of the economy, the rural population.
And that 1873 land tax reform, requiring payments in cash rather than rice, fundamentally changed the risk structure for farmers.
Let's unpack that. Why was paying in money so devastating?
Because the tax rate was fixed and payable in cash regardless of the harvest or the market price of rice. So if you had a poor harvest, or if the price of rice suddenly dropped, you still had to pay the exact same amount of money.
This created widespread debt, land loss, and fueled continuous peasant protests throughout the 1870s and 1880s.
They were protesting against a modernization process that seemed exclusively to favor urban, bureaucratic, and commercial elites.
And we see a stark difference in the experience of poverty, the hinmen between city and rural dwellers.
We do. A poverty journalist named Matsubara Iwaguro wrote that in the city slums, the College of the Poor taught how to make do for so many on so little. He emphasized the human isolation.
Official aid was virtually non-existent. The records show that only about 128 people annually in Tokyo received official assistance between 1895 and 1910.
It's nothing, but rural poverty, while equally desperate, the novelist Nagatsuka Takashi recorded families having to eat anything in winter. It offered different, albeit grim, escape valves.
Families could send their extra children to factories or brothels as indentured servants to pay off debts.
Or they could emigrate. By the end of the Meiji period, over 80,000 people had emigrated to Hawaii alone, sending vital remittances back home. The urban poor rarely had these options, as officials typically blocked city dwellers from being recruited for foreign farm work.
Another massive burden imposed primarily on the poor was universal conscription, introduced in 1873.
A policy intended to foster national unity and replace the unreliable samurai, but its implementation was disastrous at first.
The initial phrasing in the ordinance was so unfortunate. It referred to military service as a tax paid in blood.
Which sparked these absurd but incredibly damaging rumors in the countryside that the government literally planned to steal people's blood for some unknown government ritual. This led directly to severe rural riots that had to be suppressed by force.
And the conscription system itself was fundamentally unfair.
It allowed men to legally escape service by either paying a staggering 270 yen, a prohibitive sum for most peasant families, or by being enrolled in higher education.
So as a result, conscription overwhelmingly fell on the shoulders of the sons of poorer rural families, precisely those who had already left primary school and entered the job market.
And while only about 10% of men examined were conscripted during Meiji, the cost for those families that were hit was profound. The sources reveal that draft evasion became a cottage industry.
Desperate families would bribe local officials to correct their son's age on the kuseki, the household registry, claiming the son was 21 instead of 20, making him ineligible for the physical exam that year.
Or they resorted to these desperate, almost comic physical tricks, like drinking large amounts of salty soy sauce before the physical, hoping to simulate symptoms of internal illness or heart disease.
The irony is that the system designed to create national equality instead just amplified existing class division.
Once conscripted, training in the Imperial Japanese Army was notoriously brutal. It was designed explicitly to break down regional and independent identity and instill rote obedience to the emperor.
Recruits were subjected to harsh, systemic beatings. One former artilleryman recalled that virtually everyone's face was black and blue from the punishments.
And the brutality was internalized and sanctioned by the system. Failure to properly maintain your Type 38 rifle, which was stamped with the chrysanthemum crest of the emperor, was treated as disrespecting the sovereign himself.
Squads were given leeway to deal out punishment internally. Second-year soldiers held kangaroo courts between the departure of officers and lights out, punishing anyone who failed an exercise or embarrassed the platoon.
The goal was unthinking obedience above all else. As one conscript noted, in the light of the full moon, the senior soldiers turned into demons.
And this exploitation extended tragically to child labor. Daughters of poor families were often sent to work as Komori nursemaids or indentured servants in wealthier households, or, increasingly, in factories.
The state tried to sanitize this practice. State-sponsored songs taught by teachers in places like Matsumoto attempted to feminize the role, claiming the Komori replaced the mother and was essential for protecting the child.
But the folk songs, the real primary sources of the experience, reveal a much darker truth.
They do. These counting songs, sung by the Komori themselves, express their resistance and the grim reality of their exploitation.
They count the injustices. 1, we are all bullied. 2, we are all hated. 6, we are all fed with terrible food. 8, we are all impregnated and shed our tears.
These sources provide a profound and unvarnished window into the human cost of the Meiji transformation. They show the deep alienation felt by the non-elite population who bore the brunt of modernization.
So despite the staggering domestic hardship, the Meiji Project did achieve its primary goal: military and industrial strength.
And Japan sought recognition as a modern power by adopting the great power game of the West, which was imperialism.
Their first step onto the international stage was military success in the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895.
This war decisively forced China out of Korea and resulted in Japan acquiring Taiwan as its first colony. This established Japan as a dominant power in East Asia.
But the true global shock came with the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905.
Japan defeated Russia, a massive European white power. This was the first time an Asian nation had defeated a European power in a major modern conflict, and it fundamentally altered the global power dynamic and racial assumptions of the time.
The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905, solidified Japan's regional dominance. It gave them paramount political, military, and economic interests in Korea, the lease of Port Arthur, and control of key railway lines.
Japan had arrived.
Yet here is the ultimate paradox that the sources emphasize. Despite achieving unprecedented modernization and proving their military superiority, Japan continued to face persistent racial discrimination and resentment from the West.
Particularly from the United States and the European colonial powers. They had done everything the West had demanded, built the economy, modernized the military, codified the laws, yet they still weren't treated as equals.
This profound and deeply frustrating realization was powerfully captured by Kuma Shigenobu, the same statesman who had once advocated for a British-style constitution, writing in his 1921 essay, Illusions of the White Race.
A fascinating document.
In it, Kuma asserted that the white race was dangerously obsessed with the mistaken theory of their inherent superiority, holding all non-white races in contempt.
And he used Japan's success as the definitive proof against this theory.
He argued that Japan's wholesale adoption of European civilization, codifying laws, reforming the judicial and military systems, was what finally compelled the Europeans to withdraw their extraterritorial rights.
And he explicitly stated that Japan's victories over China and Russia had exploded the superstition that the world is to be ruled by the whites.
This essay is such a poignant conclusion to the Meiji era. Kuma recognized that the racial superiority bias of the West was a massive threat to world peace.
And he argued that non-white races could achieve rank with white peoples if they simply reformed their political systems and exerted themselves. He measures Japan's success entirely by its mastery of Western metrics: military strength, industry, shipping, and commerce.
Proving that modernization was the key to global recognition, even if that recognition was grudgingly given.
So what we have traced today is a dramatic, transformative arc. External pressure forced Japan open,
leading to an aggressive internal transformation aimed at achieving Western strength,
only to find themselves struggling against the very same prejudice and discrimination from the outside world they had sought to appease.
It's a history packed with dramatic tension. From the philosophical, anti-feudal debates of Fukuzawa Yukichi advocating for practical learning for Jitsugaku,
to the harsh, violent reality described in the Komori songs and the conscript's life.
It really highlights how quickly political and economic structures can change, but how deeply entrenched social issues like class poverty and global racial prejudices can remain.
And we observed that the Meiji oligarchs, led by Ito Hirobumi, made a calculated choice. They selected the authoritarian Prussian model for their constitution, a blueprint designed specifically to preserve power in the emperor and protect the military budget from democratic challenges.
Yet simultaneously, they fostered a system that required and rewarded liberal education and dynamic entrepreneurship. They had to prioritize merit and practical learning above everything else.
Which raises a final, provocative thought for you to consider. If the Meiji Constitution was designed to keep power centralized and limit rights, how much of Japan's undeniable early modern success actually lay not in that restrictive structure?
But in the unstoppable popular spirit of Jitsugaku, that practical learning and individual drive that they were forced to unleash and educate in order to successfully compete on the global stage.
For anyone diving deeper into the history of this transformative era, and especially if you're studying for IBDP history, we really want to give a special shout out to Russell Tarr of activehistory.co.uk.
You can find loads more useful material for this period and many, many others on his website. It's an incredible resource.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the roots of modern Japan.